Test. May I have to? Oh, yeah, that's plenty. All right, well, good morning. Craig got me again, and I'm sorry, Bob got me again to help out in here. He's out of town this weekend. So we're going to continue. I heard someone say that y'all did this last week, and you're right. We're going to just for a second rehash some of last week's information, and partly because I wanted to go over the map, and I wish this was better blown up to that one little corner up there. But I wanted to point out a couple of things about the first missionary journey. The direction and the cities that they visited on the first missionary journey, they started out in Antioch, where Paul had been based for some time, and traveled to the island of Cyprus first, and then up to the Pisidian Antioch, which is a different Antioch. I read that there were at one time in this region 14 cities named Antioch, because one of the Roman leaders had an uncle named something along the lines of Antioch. But anyway, we have two different Antiochs that we're talking about in these missionary journeys. There's Galatian Antioch and there's Pisidian Antioch, and the Pisidian Antioch is the one to the northwest. But that loop that they made on their first missionary journey, and especially wanted to pay attention to the Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, Lystra area. If you remember from the first missionary journey, just something struck me as I was reading this again. Paul, I guess the internal fortitude, the bravery, the guts that this man showed is really unbelievable. You know, as he was going through the first, and this is the first missionary journey. We're going to talk about the second one in a minute. As he was going through some of these towns, what happened to him? Yeah, he got flogged, he got beaten, he got stoned, he got run out of town, he got mistreated pretty badly. And that was on the way inward toward Derbe. When he got to Derbe, we read that what did he do after he got to Derbe? He didn't have enough, apparently. He turned around and he went back through the same towns that had just recently mistreated him pretty badly. And so it just is amazing to me. The more you read about the man, the more you understand about the man. He's way beyond me and what I think I can handle or what I'm brave enough to take on by myself. And then, this is hard to see, and I just wanted to get you the timeline here. Scholars place the council at Jerusalem somewhere between 49 and 51, and so we're fixing to go just past that as we get into the second missionary journey, and I want to talk about that in a second. But when he begins his second missionary journey, it is apparently fairly soon or right after the council at Jerusalem. And so what is one of the reasons that they go on this second missionary journey, other than there is obviously the one where he says, let's go back and revisit the churches that we started, but what is another reason that they went on this second missionary journey? Right. These churches had not received the letter from the Council of Jerusalem, so one of the purposes was to carry this letter and this information back with them through the churches they had visited in the first time. So let's go ahead and turn to Acts. I'm sorry, guys. This may go on all morning. Acts chapter 15. Somewhere toward the end of the chapter. I'm going to read 30 through 35 real quick. And this is, we're kind of probably rehashing. I think y'all may have already gone over this. But verse 30, so the men were sent off and went down to Antioch. Okay, the men he was talking about was who? Anybody remember? Paul and Barnabas, but who's going with them? Silas and Judas. There were two different guys that were from Jerusalem, okay, that went with Barnabas and Paul to go down, and they say down to, and we Texans can't stand that phrase. If you see Jerusalem's down below Damascus, and they were going to go down to Antioch, well, that's north, so what is that? That's up, okay? But geographically, they were traveling downward in elevation, and that gets confusing to me sometimes. But anyway, geographically in elevation, they were going down. The people read it and were glad for its encouraging message. Judas and Silas, who themselves were prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the believers. After spending some time there, they were sent off by the believers with the blessing of peace to return to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, where they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. I just wanted to point out there's in verse 34, in the NIV that I have, that's really not, there's a change. It says, but Silas remained. Now, in this version, it doesn't say that, but in a minute, we'll find out that Silas probably did remain, or if he didn't remain, he came back at one point. But this is the same Silas we're about to be introduced to on this missionary journey with Paul. After they had been there and preached, Paul and Barnabas and several others had remained in Antioch again, where again he was based in the first missionary church journey was based out of that same Antioch town, the one on the right, not the one on the left. But they worked in Antioch for a long time, strengthening the church there. But in a little while, Barnabas and Paul, and especially Paul, I guess his wounds had healed enough from the first missionary journey. He says, let's go back and visit the people where we had established churches. And they're going to go right back to these same towns where he had been mistreated pretty badly the first time around. Again, Paul has no concern for his own physical well-being. What is his tunnel vision? What is his primary goal in life? Spread the gospel. I mean, that's guys, there's an example right there. That's all he thought about. He didn't give any thought to his own personal safety, and we're going to find out that's going to flare up again. But he didn't give any thought to his own personal safety. He wasn't held back because there's a good chance I'm going to get beaten or mistreated there, because he already had been once. He was willing to let it all go for the gospel, and his tunnel vision in providing the support and the information to people about Jesus ought to be something that speaks to us. Okay, we oughtn't give thought to our own personal safety, or especially our own personal comfort. I mean, I think today maybe even that is more of importance, because I mean, really, how many of you really worry about going somewhere and you're going to be abused? You don't really have if I'm going to go to Dallas, is there a chance I'm going to get abused for the gospel? Well, I've been to Dallas before, and I didn't get stoned or thrown out of town or any of those things. So, what I'm looking at here is even comfort is something that Paul didn't give a thought to, and that's for me. That's for me to remember as well. Wilford.
They didn't accept Paul. How did Paul accept what Christ had already told them back earlier? If you're not accepted in a certain town, take the dust off your shoes and go.
Well, and that's right. A lot of towns, he did say that. He did just give up on them. But in these towns, we do find that there were enough people that listened to him, believers in these towns, that he was willing to risk his life to go back and help them. There may not have been very many. It might have been a small group. But Paul was willing to go back and at great personal risk, continue to strengthen them and build them up, and offer them support and comfort. Okay. All right. Now we realize that Paul and Barnabas and maybe even Silas are still in Antioch, and the verse 36, it says, sometime later Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. So this is sometime, who knows? I didn't even read any conjectures to how long that had been. But it had been long enough that Paul felt like it was time that they go back and check up on these folks. Okay, could have been a year. It easily could have been a year between these visits. All right, now we all know what's coming here. This is a verse that we've all heard many times and talked about many times and heard preached on many, many times. But we come to the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. And I think we've also probably heard many, many times that yes, this was a disagreement between them. Yes, there was some friction or something that happened, but as a result, what happened? Two journeys. Okay, now that's interesting. It's interesting, and we don't really have any record or any knowledge of where Barnabas and John Mark went, other than the fact that he went back to his hometown. Basically, we believe we know that Barnabas and John Mark went back to Cyprus. Well, we think that's where Barnabas. Well, I guess it is where Barnabas was from. So they went back to their hometown, and look where Paul went. He didn't even go to that island. Now this map shows him coming back through here. We may or may not have. I didn't see that in the verses, but they start out from Antioch and go up and go directly back to the towns that they had come from the first time. Although by a different route. So they're covering a whole different territory than Barnabas and John Mark do. And it would be interesting. I'd love to have had some record of Barnabas and John Mark's journey and how things went with them and where all they went, but we unfortunately just don't have that. But by the grace of God, 2 missionary teams are now out spreading the good news and strengthening churches and building people up who had been reached by the gospel on the first trip. John Mark, I want to just talk about them just a little bit. Tell me about John Mark. Who was he? He was on the first missionary journey for how long? Yeah, basically the first leg, and the pointer isn't working here, so, maybe you can't see it on the screen. Where they've crossed. The first time they started out going to Cyprus and then went up onto the mainland of Asia, they're at Perga. And somewhere in that area, John Mark gave it up and went back. I don't know why, but even though he went back the first time, the second time Barnabas felt like he was worth taking along and went ahead and took him. So, even when we make mistakes, even when we chicken out, if you will, I don't know if that's what he did, but God's going to be there to be with us, to go back out again and try it again. And as far as we know, John Mark and Barnabas did well on that trip. Later on in some of Paul's writings, even though he had a disagreement over John Mark here, what does Paul say about John Mark later on in some of his writings? Anybody remember? Yeah, John Mark's been a great encouragement to me. He's been very helpful to me. So, there's good news, I guess, that John Mark, that he did.
I think it's an important point there that Paul, when we take a position about something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's personal. Paul knew some things. He knew about the journey. He knew Mark, and he said he's not the man for this trip.
Right.
And it's not personal against Mark. He's just not ready.
Yeah. True. And what's interesting about the first, what he's saying is that Paul may have had some Spirit-given knowledge that John Mark wasn't the guy. He chose someone else. He picked up Silas, who was John Mark was probably Jewish, but Silas was definitely what? He was Greek. He was not a Jewish guy. So, and we'll find out about that in a little. I'm sorry. He was Jewish. He was not Greek, and we'll find out about that in a minute. The other thing that was interesting is here's the first missionary journey. Look at the second one, and part of this is a scale issue. The scale is a lot bigger on the other one, but look at the difference in the amount of ground covered. So if John Mark bailed after just a little part of the leg on the first one, and I don't know that Paul knew, I don't think Paul knew how far this one was going to go, that's my personal belief, when this one started, but this is a trip of many, many times magnitude what the first missionary journey was in miles traveled. So anyway, we see personal conflicts, but we see growth, and we see an increased amount of spreading of the gospel because of that. And I don't believe that this personal conflict ended in anybody treating each other sinfully or any awful behavior. It was just something there that Paul knew wasn't right, and so he didn't want to take John Mark along, but he did choose Silas, who was one of the believers that had come down from Jerusalem to help spread the good news that they had delivered at the Jerusalem council. So anyway, Paul and Silas set out, and this time, rather than going to Cyprus and up that way, they go back up kind of the reverse direction. Interestingly enough, Barnabas goes to Cyprus, where he was from. Paul heads up and goes through Tarsus. What's interesting about Tarsus in Paul's life? That's where he's from. So they kind of went back to their hometowns where they had started out in each case. I don't know what that much means, but that's just an interesting fact. And so as we continue on, we see that Paul and Silas start moving backwards through the towns where they had been the first time, and one of the first places they come to is a town. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra. So they're moving. There's Derbe. I don't know if you can see. Can y'all see that? Can y'all read that up there? I can barely read it. My pointer's not working, but it's after you've come up and made the corner and started heading west on the upper leg. Derbe is in the middle, and then Lystra and Iconium are two towns that are very close together right there. So what's interesting when they come to Lystra? What happens in Lystra? Okay, Timothy. They pick up another companion for this journey, and Timothy. You know, we've all heard the stories, and we all kind of know who Timothy is. He was a very young man whose father was what? Greek. All right. What did Paul do to or for? I don't know if to Timothy. What happened to Timothy after Paul meets up with him and decides he's going to go on this trip? He circumcised him. Now, when are Jewish boys normally circumcised? Okay, on the 8th day of their life. And what are the chances that any of them remember that? Not very good. It's a very, very kind of brutal process. Well, Timothy is a young man. I mean, we don't know, teenage, early 20s, whatever. He was a young man. And if you do it to someone on the 8th day, there's reasons for that. God saw fit that they did it on the 8th day, and I think scientific studies show that there's certain coagulants or things available in a child's body on the 8th day that prevent the bleeding from being too bad after the process. But Timothy, he doesn't have that advantage. So Timothy is circumcised, and that was a big decision for him. Timothy's mom was what? Jewish. His mom was Jewish, and his father was Greek. So obviously, even though his mom is listed as a believer, the dad didn't want to go along with the circumcision rite, and apparently they had not done so. Later on, we find that there's a gentleman named Titus who was a Greek, and that he traveled with Paul and was his companion. But what did they not do to Titus? They didn't circumcise him. So there's something beyond what I understand here, but Paul understands through the Spirit that it's important that Timothy be circumcised, because at first they're going mainly to Jewish audiences and they're going to go to synagogues, and I don't think that there would have been the ability for Timothy to travel about as freely with them had he not been circumcised. So he has been circumcised into the Jewish culture now, more than just being part of the Jewish religion. So he is now circumcised and is free later on, if he wanted to go to the temple and go on in and worship. He wasn't going to be confined to the outer courts of the temples like the rest of the Gentiles were. And then there may have been some reason for him to be able to move about in the synagogues easier if he was circumcised.
Was that one of the discussions that they had when they went back to Jerusalem, though, was over the circumcision?
Yeah, it was. And what's interesting, that right after maybe a year after the Jerusalem Council, they still have the letter. Their intention is to spread the letter to the other churches about they're not going to require Gentiles to follow the circumcision rites as they are.
Well, Timothy couldn't.
Exactly.
And the Jews knew that Timothy's father, that's where he was from, and they
Right.
knew him and his family, and knew that his daddy was a Greek.
Right.
So that's the only way the Jews, Christians would accept him.
Well, yeah, the Jewish Christians who were having,
They had received that message.
right. Now, there's a lot of reasons that he did this to Timothy and not to other people. And again, it goes along with the whole idea that Paul later on describes himself as the man for everybody. Okay, if I need to reach this group, then I become this group. If I need to reach this group, I become as this group. This is part of Paul's process. He's making sure that whatever he does right off the bat is not an insult or in any way inhibits the ability to spread the gospel. So getting Timothy circumcised allows him access to places in order to let him spread the gospel. Roxy.
It also creates the cultural divide. It's an absolute commitment. Timothy's father wasn't just being a jerk. You can't, none of us know about anyone else in here and whether or not they've been circumcised. But in their culture, when you went to the gymnasium, you were nude.
Yeah.
All nude. Public baths. On the girls' side, sometimes had a towel, but on the guys' side, they were completely nude most of the time. So something like that would have to be explained. It
Right.
was much more, obvious
Right.
than it is in our culture. And his Greek father was giving him the social credential to be able to function in that society.
Timothy's unique. I mean, his background and his upbringing allowed him, as in every other person that we read of that is instrumental in spreading the gospel, the backgrounds that each one of these individuals has is unique and allows them unique opportunities that other people don't have. Same is true for us. My background and my experiences in my life allow me to talk to people that other people may not be able to relate to and to as easily get in with as others. And so, God always is in control. God always has a plan. God always knows what's needed and what's necessary. And if we will allow him, will provide us the direction to go. So it's always amazing. We find out later on that Paul is just the right guy to do things because of his learning and his background. Timothy may be just the right guy to do things because of his dual citizenship nature. Paul's dual citizenship nature comes into play in here in just a minute. And so a lot of things that seem like just historical information to us ought to help us understand that we ourselves are like Paul and we're like Timothy. We have each one of us has unique abilities and things that God has prepared for us. We've just got to get out of the way and let the Spirit guide our lives, not ourselves. And those talents and those things that we've been through will be an advantage to us in reaching somebody for the gospel. So to me, it's always a fascinating thing to read that little section. It said his father was a Greek, and maybe I'm missing something, but it didn't say he was a non-believer. And there were a lot of Greeks who were believers in God. We're going to read about them in a minute, God-fearing people. We're going to see that people were God-fearing, but not necessarily of the Jewish faith and not necessarily of Jewish practice, and that they weren't all circumcised. So I think what I had read is that when it mentions God-fearing Greeks, those are people who are God-fearing and have adopted Jewish law and custom to accept that they were not circumcised, and so didn't go fully into that, go to that extent. And then, of course, the Council at Jerusalem has a lot to say about that. Okay, so they pick up Timothy in Lystra, and they begin to go around in the area of Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe preaching. They traveled throughout what we were told is Phrygia and Galatia, and so that's that region right there around Lystra. But something interesting happens here, and I'll be honest, I don't fully understand it. We're looking in verses roughly 6, starting in 6, especially verse 7. I want to read that. when they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia. Okay. Okay, you see the big circle up there? The big oval up there to the left? There's some writing. Up further up there's the Black Sea. That is Bithynia, up kind of north, right up by the Black Sea, which you can't read, but up in that area. And I don't know if you can see, as they're going out on their way on the red line, there's a town called Antioch, which is Pisidian Antioch. And then there's a long gap over to a place called Troas. And there's no towns dotted there. Well, the reason for that is they didn't stop in any towns. For some reason, and we'll talk about it, but for some reason, the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of Jesus both have intervened and prevented these guys from stopping and spreading the good news in these particular regions. I have little explanation for that other than God knows what He's doing, and I'm not going to try to explain it away. In verse 7, when they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia, went down to Troas. And Troas is all the way over here on the upper left corner of the map. It's the first city you see on the dotted line. It's the first city. So they've traveled a pretty good distance across there. Hang on. Okay. Oh, this is a little bit better map. Can you see Galatia and Asia? Can y'all read those words? Can anybody see that? Kind of in the middle. Asia's right in the middle. So they go across a huge area and don't stop at all. Okay. This is me Google Mapsing. Can you see the dark blue line there? That's a modern highway, a modern way of getting from two Turkish towns, and I couldn't pronounce either one of those towns for you, but those are the roughly modern day equivalent of the two cities that we go from Pisidian Antioch to Troas on this leg of the journey. Guys, it is along that route, it is about 430 miles, okay? Google Map tells me you can walk 2.97 miles per hour, okay? If you pull up a Google Map and you get driving directions, it'll tell you how long it'll take to drive, but if you hit the little guy, it'll tell you how long it would take to walk on a particular route. At that rate, at 2.97 miles per hour, that's 144 hours of walking, okay? And that's probably in good conditions, when you're not getting beat up by robbers, when you're not having to hide from highwaymen, when you're not having to get off the path to go around something you feel nervous about. But 144 hours, if you walked 12 hours a day, that's 12 days, okay? Chances are he didn't do it in exactly 12 days, but they hoofed across a huge stretch of the continent, basically walked from one side of Turkey to the other, and probably that journey took at least 2 weeks to accomplish on foot. I guess my modern reading on this and not stopping and doing what I did here, just going that in a couple of verses here, I just skip over the meaning of that. I skip over the implications of going from Pisidian Antioch to Troas, okay? That is a huge personal risk. They're crossing a pretty barren section of the world. And I don't know today if it's any riskier, maybe just as risky to walk that same stretch today as it was back then. But again, we see Paul leaving out of an area that he was somewhat comfortable with, because he had been through the towns of Lystra and Derbe and Iconium, not that far from Pisidian Antioch. That's a region they'd already traveled in once. Now they've traveled in again, and he's willing now, because he received something. And what did he receive that caused him to take that journey? He's already in Troas. But during the night, once they arrived at Troas, during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia, standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Where you see my blue line end right there is roughly what was then Troas, and there's now a sea journey to get across, and it's not a very long one. Matter of fact, it's I think it's only like 30 miles across this body of water, and it's a 2-day. Apparently, it turns out to be a 2-day trip. But it doesn't take very long to do that. But Paul and his companions have just finished a 2+ week journey across what is now Turkey. And without hesitation, after seeing a vision, Paul's ready to jump on a ship and keep going, and now into areas that to my knowledge, he's never been in before. This second journey is huge compared to the first one. So he's going into new ground. He is trusting in the Spirit completely. When the Spirit tells him to go, he doesn't pull a Jonah. He doesn't run the other direction. When the Spirit tells him to go, he goes. Now, Paul's experiences to date with what happens to him when he enters new cities, what do you think his confidence level is in going to a new city and being left alone? Pretty low, I would think pretty low. He's more often than not, we read about him encountering tremendous resistance and tremendous trouble and often physical abuse. But again, after a grueling 2.5 week journey, he's ready to go. Someone appears to him in a vision and asks for help. He's ready to go. He knows that the Spirit is in control and is leading him, so they get ready to go, and they go. Now, at Troas, where their 2.5 week journey or 2 week journey ended, what do we find? What happens in Troas? Verse 11. What's a little change that I'm sure we've all heard before? What changes in verse 11? I think they put out to sea, but who put out to sea? We put out to sea. Up to this point, the word "we" hasn't appeared as the writer of the book has been operating from. And you English people help me out here. I don't know, we change person here. We go from someone who's an observer to someone who's a part of the process. And so we pick up a guy, and it doesn't really say specifically in verse 11 who this is, but who is this? Luke. Okay, we pick up Luke. Later on, we find out Dr. Luke. We find out Luke is a physician. What do we know about Luke nationality-wise? What do we know he's not? He's not Jewish, okay? He is a Greek. Some of the things I read think he was from Galatian Antioch, which would have been not far from where Paul had grown up, but Luke was a doctor. Luke was a physician. Luke was a Gentile, a Greek, a non-Jewish entity. What is unique about Luke then as far as writers of the New Testament? He's authentic, but he's the only one that's not Jewish. Luke is our only non-Jewish, I believe that's correct, unless we don't really know who the Hebrew writer was, but from named books, we know that Luke was unique in that he was a Gentile and the only Gentile writer in the New Testament. So we leave out of Troas, including Luke. So apparently, for some reason, Luke was in Troas, even though maybe he was from Antioch. He's made his way over to Troas. We don't know that he didn't travel with these guys over there, but for some reason his verb tense changed in verse 11, and he began writing this from a we standpoint. I don't know that that's significant, guys. It just, I just find it fascinating that this change occurred. Let's see. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm not moving along very well. All right. Well, when Troas, they go across a body of water. They sailed to a town called Samothrace, and then they went to Neapolis, and from there they traveled to Philippi. These are just little short distances, maybe one-day journeys of each, up to the various towns on the very far left upper corner. That's Macedonia. So he's over in Macedonia now, right? He got the call from Macedonia, and he's in Macedonia now.
Up to this point, they were in Greek territories. Now this is a Roman.
Right. Yeah. They've traveled across into Roman territory. This is a new world in a lot of ways for Paul. I mean, he's far from Jerusalem, far from Galatia, far from his hometown, far from the things that he's used to, and he has traveled over to another continent. Every missionary journey did what? Got bigger. The third one, he goes, Roxy. By the third journey, I know we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but by the third journey, his travels take him even further. So we just see a little development in Paul. Just the way God does us. We take some steps out there, and then we take some more steps out there, and then we take some bigger steps out there. And Paul's following that same pattern. One thing I do want to point out, when you talk about these towns, Philippi, and it says it's a Roman colony, do you remember back at the very first part of Acts when they're at the day of Pentecost and there's a list of people? Where are these people from? Okay, all those different places. So even though Paul is roaming far afield, he's expecting to find what? Some Jews, or Jews or Christians. Okay. Yeah, Roxy pointed out there is a war between the Greeks and the Romans at that point in time. Again, another reason not to go to an area that Paul just jumps on a ship and goes to. I was going to say it ought to be a lesson for us as well, because sometimes we are fearful to take the gospel into rough areas because we're afraid of what will happen to us, and Paul's not afraid of what's going to happen to him. Paul is not afraid of what's going to happen to him. Remember that, always. That's a underlying thing in Paul's missions, is that he is not afraid of what's going to happen to him. All he wants to do is spread the good news of his Savior. But what I wanted to say was, if there is a large Jewish and possibly even Christian, the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people were converted. Not likely all those people were from Jerusalem. Those people were from all over. So Paul's moving out into places, and he may be finding believers there. But one thing he is finding is Jews. And folks, remember the journey that from Pisidian Antioch across there took a couple of weeks. Now, there are ways of sailing, but if you lived in this area and you were a Jew, what did you do at least once a year? You go back to Jerusalem. That is not like driving to Fort Worth, okay? Going back to Jerusalem was a huge commitment to these people who are Jewish. So I just wanted to bring that up. I mean, we in our modern world forget about how easy it is to drive to church every morning. These guys would spend days and possibly even weeks going back to Jerusalem for at least one appointed feast a year. Now, there were 3 they could have gone to, but I think primarily they tried to go at least one of the feasts a year. And that's a big trip. That's not a quick deal. Other thing I meant to point out as we were talking about that journey from Pisidian Antioch to Troas, 433 miles. That's like walking from here down to Corpus Christi. Okay, that's it's not from here to Bridgeport. It's from here to Corpus Christi. So that's a long walk. And these Jews did this kind of thing once a year. The ones that couldn't afford sea travel had to walk across land like he did. And so this could be a 5-week round trip for them if they had to walk the journey. So anyway, we see that the gospel and the good news is getting further and further and further afield as time goes on. Was that the second bell? Okay. Oh man. Well, Bob wanted me to get through 1640, and I'm not going to get anywhere near there. But let's go back to where we were in Philippi. In Philippi, on the Sabbath day, they went outside the city to see if they could find a place of prayer. What does that indicate? That there probably was not in Philippi. Probably was not a synagogue. Paul's pattern had been going to the synagogue, and as a synagogue tradition, someone traveling coming in would be asked to speak. Well, in Philippi, we already know that we assume that there is no synagogue because Paul didn't go in there. So he did know, though, that people had a tendency to gather down by the river on the Sabbath day to pray. So he goes down there and speaks to them. And what's interesting is, does it mention any guys being down at the river praying? Women, okay? The gospel and the good news here is open to more than just men, right? Many of the most important people we run across in this process of spreading the gospel are women. Lydia was one of them. She was the first convert to Christianity in Philippi that we know of. Now, there may have been others that had come from Jerusalem, but she's the first one that converted, and it was such an overwhelming event for her that she invited guys that she just met, okay, to come and stay at her home. She knew these men, though, through the Spirit, and trusted them that they would be safe to stay at her house. And so she persuaded them to stay at her house. Okay, that was the second bell. I'll tell Bob, y'all start at verse 16 next week, but I wish I'd have got here. Paul and Silas are in prison. How many people were in the party at this time? Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. Okay. Luke. Anyway, who's thrown in jail? Just 2 of them. And we get into the reasons for that later on. But anyway, all right, well, thank y'all very much. I hope this has not been, sometimes these history lessons in a way are a little bit dry, and I hope that just remembering some of the things they went through for the sake of the gospel is inspiring to all of us. So thank y'all very much.